So hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Chitheads podcast. My guest today is Diane Dreher. Diane is a best-selling author, researcher, and positive psychology coach. Her books, The Tao of Inner Peace, The Tao of Personal Leadership, The Tao of Womanhood, Inner Gardening, and Your Personal Renaissance, have been translated into 10 languages, and her work has been featured in media outlets including USA Today, Entrepreneur, Redbook, Glamour, Cosmopolitan, Science of Mind, radio and TV talk shows, and websites on leadership and personal growth. Dreher has a PhD in Renaissance English Literature from UCLA, as well as a master's degree in counseling. She is a HeartMath clinical practitioner and a professional certified coach with the International Coaching Federation. Her research on positive psychology and hope has been published online and in academic books and journals. She is currently Professor Emerita and Associate Director of the Applied Spirituality Institute at Santa Clara University and a lecturer in the Positive Psychology Guild in the UK. So hello, Diane. Thank you so much for joining me today.
I'm delighted to be here, Jacob.
So as we were speaking just a moment ago before we officially started the interview, I was mentioning to you that I've been very much enjoying reading through your book, The Tao of Inner Peace, which I'd just like to say at the outset is now released as an audiobook. But really, this is your first book, yes?
It's my first trade book. I've published books in Renaissance literature, literary criticism before that.
All right. Well, I thought that was very interesting, the PhD in Renaissance English literature. So what led you from Renaissance English literature and that doctoral work into Taoism? How did that transition happen?
Well, gradually, I suppose. The Tao tells us the journey of 1,000 miles begins with a single step. However, my step into Renaissance literature, my dissertation was on spiritual development in Renaissance literature. And I guess my core passion is discovering spiritual development in Renaissance literature, in Eastern philosophy, in my own spiritual practice, meditation, yoga. So I've been fascinated by the convergence of East and West for most of my life. I grew up as the child of an Air Force officer, and we moved all the time. And when I was 10 years old, we lived in the Philippine Islands, which was mind-blowing because my father brought back art and culture and things. He was a pilot from Hong Kong, from Tokyo, and I fell in love with the beauty, the serenity of Asian art and tried to duplicate it, tried to paint pictures like that. So from age 10, I was interested in the Eastern way of perceiving things, so much so that when we were transferred back to the States in Missouri, I was painting the picture of a palm tree in my art class. And all the other students laughed at me and said, Diane doesn't know how to draw a tree because all the branches are coming out of the top. And I realized that there is no one way for a tree to be, that there are trees in the East and trees in the West. There are pine trees and palm trees. And there's this sense of both and instead of right or wrong, either or, all or nothing. So Eastern philosophy gives me a holistic vision of life, which I think is really essential these days and which our world really needs. But I've been on that path for quite some time.
So I'm curious actually just about the spiritual development in Renaissance literature. What was that spiritual development? Was that a sort of a Christian kind of couched in Christian religion, or what was that?
Sort of. I focused on a poet that people don't know much about, Thomas Traherne, who believed that nature was a gift from God. And it was our duty to enjoy the world aright, and he didn't seem to, in those days, this was unusual. He didn't seem to believe in sin, in original sin. He believed that we were all created, like Adam and Eve, and that the garden was our garden, and we were to respect it, enjoy it, love it, and as he put it, to enjoy the world aright, which meant to meditate on nature.
Mm.
You can see that there's a real similarity. I mean, Thomas Traherne was a 17th century poet, and he didn't read Taoism, but his worldview was very similar.
That's beautiful. I'm so interested. Thomas Traherne?
Traherne, Traherene. Yeah.
Excellent. I'm going to have to look that up because that just sounds so fascinating. And it reminds me, I was speaking to someone else the other day who is a theologian, but he's done a bunch of work with essentially Christian mystics, some of who were women, who also had this much more, very different from kind of what you would think of as sort of Christian orthodoxy in terms of the relationship with the earth and the invitation towards the affirmation of life, kind of as you're saying. So we're moving into Taoism here, which has obviously been a huge kind of influence in your life and your work. And obviously all of your books have the Tao as kind of a central hub or component.
Mhm.
And so we've actually done a very few interviews. I think I've only interviewed one person out of almost 150 episodes who has worked in Taoism, not because from lack of interest, just because it seems like they're for whatever reason, whether I just haven't encountered them as much or what, but I'm really excited to talk about some of the principles of Taoism because I think many of our people in our audience are very interested in Taoism, and yet we haven't had this opportunity to kind of dig into some of the principles. So what are the sort of fundamental features of Taoism?
Okay. Well, Lao Tzu apparently wrote the Tao Te Ching over 25 centuries ago during the Warring States period in ancient China, when his world as he knew it was falling apart. Does that sound familiar?
Mm.
So he found hope wandering through nature, connecting with the symbolism in nature. He observed the lessons in a mountain stream, saw that water was gentle and nurturing, yet with perseverance can cut through solid rock. So that there's a strength in yin, in nurturing. There's the flexibility, the resilience that he found in a grove of bamboo, which bends with the wind so it doesn't break. So, and ultimately, he observed and wrote in the Tao Te Ching about the energies that comprise the universe, the energies of yin, the nurturing, and yang, the active, both and, mountain and valley, day and night, open and closed. We need both. So the Tao gives us the wisdom of living systems, the patterns of energy within and around us, because as he noted, we are part of nature. And the Chinese character Ren for a person looks like an upside down V. And one horizontal line across means big. It's like, the person is holding the arms out saying big. Another line above that line is heaven or nature, so that the human being, the character for the human being is part of the character of nature. We are one with nature. And our principles that help us live a balanced life are the same principles that keep nature in balance. And we can be inspired and guided by studying nature.
Yeah. And yet it seems that, we're more interested in studying our computer screens at this point in life than nature, unfortunately. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. But I wanted to touch on just a couple of the other concepts that I thought were really seem to be quite central to the Taoist kind of cosmology or philosophy. And you mentioned yin and yang, and then there's also the Te and the Tao, yes? And I'm wondering if you could say a little bit about that.
Okay, the Tao means the way or the path, and the Tao Te Ching, right? And Te or De means character or virtue. And then Qing is a sacred book. So that the title of the Tao Te Ching means the book of the way, walking the path of virtue. Some people say walking the path with heart. Being aware of our hearts, the heart of our deepest values as we walk the path of life, I suppose.
And then what about Wu Wei?
Okay, Wu Wei, doing nothing.
Very hard for me to do, Diane. I have to say.
Very difficult. It's a yin skill. You know, we have yin and yang, the active yang and the contemplative yin. And as a meditator, you do have contemplative yin, okay, in life, without which there is no balance. Well, there are times when the best thing to do when we don't know what to do, especially when we're feeling chronically stressed, is to just pause and wait and watch for the energies and listen and wait for right timing. So Wu Wei in my life today sometimes means pausing when I feel stressed and taking a few deep mindful breaths to cut the stress reaction so that I can go back to a more centered space and act wisely. That helps when I get an email that makes me irritable. Instead of just shooting back a flaming email at somebody, to just pause and say, okay, you know, let's have the wisdom of Wu Wei and let's not do anything right now. And sometimes, especially when it's sent an email to a lot of people, my watching and waiting, the wisdom of Wu Wei, somebody else answers. I get a new insight that would help me respond more clearly. So again, that's very alien to our busy, active, yang, Western worldview. But I think it's essential. If we don't really know what to do, maybe we should not do. Maybe we should be and listen.
Yeah, I mean, especially in this culture, it seems like Wu Wei is a radical act. You know, it's something that takes a lot of seemingly an ability to disentangle ourselves from the social forces that would tell us to do quite the opposite, or and also suggest that doing the opposite, i.e. being hyper productive, is actually what is going to lead to fulfillment, when in fact it leads to imbalance, as you're saying.
Yes, in the Western world, we confuse being fulfilled with being filled full. Activities, busy cram schedule, noise, and that is not really fulfillment. It's the opposite.
I love that. We confuse fulfillment with being filled full. That's so good. That's going to be on one of the quote images that we put on Instagram for this episode, for sure. So I wanted to read this from your book, which I thought was really beautiful, just about the Tao. And the Tao cannot be reduced to names and formulas. It is Wu Ming without a name, because it's the source of all existence. In its infinite creative potential, the Tao is Wu, eternal non-being. In its creative existence, it is you, eternal being. Why you? Eternally changing and evolving, it is neither one nor the other, always both. So it's so beautiful. And I mean, the whole book is sort of, you know, it has many, many beautiful quotes like this. When I think about Taoism, you know, before I read your book, when I've thought about Taoism, oftentimes I think about a very elegant sort of worldview and philosophy of balance. But I don't think so much, just because of my own lack of knowledge and education around this, so much of contemplative practice of the type that we find in other traditions, that is so, you know, thoroughly kind of explicated in texts and all of that. but in your book, there's many, many practices and many sort of suggested contemplations and meditations. So is there, but I'm curious, is there kind of a formal path of practice in Taoism, or is this more of a kind of modern intersection?
Oh, good question. Well, there is religious Taoism, which has certain very, explicit rituals,
Mm,
going within and sending energy through the body. And then there's Taoism as a philosophy, which is more of what I subscribe to, as a way of looking at the world that expands our awareness. And the quote that you just read about the fact that we cannot reduce the Tao to a definition, you know, the word that can be defined is not the eternal word. The Tao, that path that can be charted is not the eternal path. Because once we define something, we limit it. And we have to do that, or else we wouldn't be able to get through our days. We'd walk down the street and we'd be transfixed by every single tree. And instead of saying, okay, tree, or car, we'd be having a kind of a religious experience with each one, so that we have to categorize in order to to just get through our days. But categorizing is very close to stereotyping,
mm,
which means we reduce everything to one limited definition, like my classmates in the Midwest who saw a tree being the kind of tree they were used to seeing, and they couldn't recognize that there were other kinds of trees. Or if we see a human being and we reduce that person to ageist, sexist, and all kinds of other stereotypes, instead of recognizing the richness and the infinity of that person, or indeed of the person that we are. We are Wu in the sense that we are never complete as long as we're alive. We're always evolving and becoming. And what I like about that Tao quote is that it's very close to quantum physics, with particles, which are, solid, as it were, and waves, which are not. And they're, the physicists tell us that reality is made up of particle waves, and that they transform, from one to the other. And that's what happens in our lives. Our thoughts become actions. Our thought of, maybe I want to learn more about Sanskrit, or, a certain subject. So then the action is to actually take a step to do that. Our thoughts structure and create our reality. And a thought is invisible. We can't see it or touch it. It's not tangible, but it leads to tangible results. And so the Tao is both, eternally becoming and eternally being.
mm. I just want to go back to something that you said, because I've never really heard it described this way. The way you describe words as limiting, but also suggest that if we didn't have those, if we were navigating the world without words, that actually we would be, the words help us to sort of live a pragmatic life, and without them we would just be kind of in a mystical state of rapture with all of these, the infinite blurb that is the car, and the infinite, green shrubby thing that is the tree. And I love that idea, because it actually it illustrates the pragmatic nature of words, and how actually need words to just live kind of a practical day-to-day life. But also it suggests that the words also we need to understand what they're there for, and that they also then stand in our way of actually accessing a little bit of that divine rapture that you're suggesting is there when the words do dissolve. And I think that's just beautiful. I hadn't quite thought about the relationship between words and the divine in that way, and how they're actually pragmatic at the same time that they're limiting.
Yeah, they help us navigate through our lives. But as we're traveling and navigating, we don't pause long enough to have that rapture. So it's, I guess it's another kind of yin and yang. We need both,
Yeah. So to this point about contemplative practice, I'm curious, and since you included so many in your book, maybe we can talk about just a couple for those who are listening who really want to be able to learn how to kind of cultivate this sense of the Tao in their lives, this balance, who feel that, not, simply thinking about it, it doesn't quite work for them. What are some practices that kind of, effectuate this change to live in alignment with the Tao?
Oh my gosh. Okay. Well, for one thing, there are certain spiritual practices. The Tao says, can you go through your days holding fast to the Tao, releasing your tension as you focus your breathing? Can you clear your vision and open yourself to life? So that there's a sense of, as in mindfulness meditation, pausing and taking a deep breath and realizing, breathing in, we are breathing in peace, for example. I have a number of short practices in my book about breathing in peace, breathing out tension. And what's interesting is that these practices work according to psychologists and neuroscientists, because pausing for slow, deep breathing cuts the stress reaction. Mm-hmm. And this, the Heart Math Institute, there's heart-centered, heart-focused breathing, which cuts the stress reaction. There's a Center for Compassion, Altruism, Research and Education at Stanford, led by Jim Doty, who's a neurosurgeon. Again, slow, focused, mindful breathing cuts the stress reaction. And the Center for Compassion, they're committed to this, because we cannot be compassionate about others when we're in a defensive state, stressed out, trying to protect ourselves. We become very self-centered when we're under stress. And literally what happens is that our higher brain centers are cut off because we get into fight, flight, or freeze. So very important physiologically. Jim Doty told me that, actually it's in his book too, this beautiful book called Into the Magic Shop. I guess it's a short digression. He grew up with an alcoholic father who could not hold down a job. And his mother was suicidally depressed and was trying to kill herself repeatedly. And this was a dysfunctional family. At age 12, he wandered into a magic shop in a strip mall. A wonderful woman who was the mother of the owner said to him, I will teach you magic if you come back here every day. And she taught him mindfulness meditation. And she also fed him lunch because there was no food in the house and they had been homeless. And so from a childhood, which would be predictive of, not becoming an internationally known neurosurgeon and a friend of the Dalai Lamas and a professor at Stanford, we would not have expected that from him. But the slow, deep, mindful breathing he uses when he is in a really challenging brain surgery. And he described that in his book. He was working on this boy and the brain started bleeding and he took 3 deep mindful breaths and then went in there and corrected the problem. If we don't take those deep mindful breaths, we approach our lives and our problems with a very limited way of being, fight or flight or freeze. And we don't have the resources that our higher brain centers could give us. So the ancient wisdom of the Tao and the current insights from neuroscience and positive psychology really converge. We each need to take charge of our lives and be mindful and recognize when we're triggered by stress, and then do something as simple as breathing. We do that anyway, but breathe in a mindful way, slow down, and it completely changes our perspective on the world. So that's one great spiritual practice from the Tao. Another is being in nature. I mean, we're all in nature because we're part of it, but we sometimes isolate and insulate ourselves from it. To just go out and walk around in nature And again, research has shown now that walking around in nature can help relieve depression and anxiety, which fascinating, right? Lao Tzu seemed to have known that years ago. He said at one point in the Tao, when we value ourselves as part of nature and value nature as ourselves, we're at home in the oneness of Tao. This being at home, at peace, safe, a part of something larger than ourselves. That's a major aspect of Taoist practice. So meditation, breathing, the yin, and then the yang of going outside. But actually, they're part of the same thing,
Yeah. Yeah, that's beautiful. Thank you for sharing those two. And I always love talking about breathing, because whenever the guest is speaking about it, I find myself changing my breath and breathing more deeply and mindfully. So I was having a blissed out breath response as you were describing the practice. And where else I always find myself doing that automatically is in the dentist office, when they're about to inject me with Novocaine. Because there's nothing more anxiety inducing than a massive needle that's about to go into your mouth.
I totally hear you. Yeah.
So out there, at the very least, use your mindful breathing at the dentist office. Yeah, so that's beautiful. And just again, to those who are listening, there are many other contemplations and suggested considerations and practices and experiential suggestions that are in Diane's book. So do read it, or get the audiobook, which has just been released. So let's talk a little bit about the now, the Tao of Now, and the current circumstances, just to bring, in your book at the end, especially, you talk about a Taoist politics, and so I'm curious now, since it was quite a while ago since you have written the book, how has this sort of divisiveness that we've seen emerge over the last several years, seemingly, it only gets worse and worse, and seemingly without end, how can a Taoist perspective help us to move past some of this impasse of this us versus them that is so characteristic of our politics?
Oh dear, I think we should spread Taoism throughout the world. The Tao Te Ching tells us that all life embodies yin and embraces yang through their union, achieving harmony. And that the Tao shows us a view of the world that is not either or, but both and. And what happens when we're under stress is that when our higher brain centers are shut down, or offline, at least temporarily while we're stressed, let's hope they're not totally shut down. Although sometimes for some people, that's a digression. I'm wondering, when we are in a state of chronic stress, we tend to see things as either or, all or nothing, win or lose. And it's a fight, right? It's someone who disagrees with us can become the enemy. And, then we like this back and forth, the Tao perspective encourages us, challenges us to find common ground. And there's a chapter in my book where I write about Taoist conflict resolution, which I learned from actually a wonderful man named Dudley Weeks, who was an international conflict resolution facilitator. I interviewed him, and we invited him to our campus at Santa Clara University to give workshops on conflict resolution. And he has these steps that we listen to ourselves first and say, what do I really need? We go within, right? And we have to, calm ourselves down in order to do that, because otherwise we're defensive and, anxious, and that's not going to help. And then we find a neutral place to meet with the other person and ask that person, what do you really need? Not what do you want? demand, but what do you really need? And then look for some shared needs, some common ground. And ultimately, beneath all the differences and the discord, we all have common ground. We're standing and living on it. It's called planet Earth. It's basic, okay? We have basic needs that we share in common. So to find common ground and then to take one step, Dudley calls those stepping stones, that can lead us, to create something together, in which case people in conflict can become partners. And this can happen interpersonally with relationships. It can happen at work, and it should happen internationally. They're the same exact, processes, because we're all human beings, despite our labels and our titles. So I was reading Dudley's book one day when I was department chair in the English department at Santa Clara University. And I heard this commotion outside my office, and apparently the administrative assistant and one of my faculty colleagues were having a big altercation, and they were almost in tears, yelling at each other. And I thought, oh, good, here's an opportunity. I have no idea what to do. So here's an opportunity, this is to use Dudley's practice. So I got them and I said, okay, what do you need? What do you need? And found out that the faculty member had needed something Xeroxed and copied for her class. And she had said, put a note or something on the administrative assistant's desk, but she didn't say when she needed it by. And so here she was trying to run off to class, and it wasn't there, and it was embarrassing, and she was upset. And okay, lack of communication. So what do you need? What do you need? Together they came up with a nice little form that we later used in our department that the faculty could fill out and say, name, what do you need? When do you need it by? How many copies? Whatever. It was simple. But in doing that and preparing that together, they became partners, and then they became friends because they recognized that, they weren't enemies. They simply needed to work on something together. They needed to build a bridge instead of a wall. I mean, that's a simple example. Dudley has more examples in his book. He was working in an inner city neighborhood, and there was, crime, and, people were upset. The homeowners were upset. The people who owned little businesses downtown were upset because there had been fights on the street, and nobody was happy. So he got people together and said, what do you think your community needs? And some of the teenage gang members were also there, parents, children, whatever. And he said, okay, and he had them write them down, and he said, how many shared needs do you think you had? And they figured, not those people, we don't have anything in common with those people, those teenage gangs, et cetera, those, business people. Well, they had a lot of shared needs. And the first thing they thought they needed would be street lights, because the streets were so dark, at night, people didn't want to come downtown, and the businesses were losing money. The teenage gangs were having problems because they couldn't recognize their own gang members from the gangs from the other side of town, and they were beating up some of the wrong people. So they made a petition to the city council. They got streetlights installed, and somehow they all realized they could work together. They built a community center and a community health center, and they built a much more harmonious community. Because despite all their differences in perspectives, they realized they had shared needs. So the crime obviously was reduced. The lights helped with that, but they brought more light to their lives on many levels by recognizing their shared needs and by working in partnership, so that instead of the false dilemma of either or, there needs to be a both and the people involved need to be brought together to use their perspectives and their talents to create that bridge, that Taoist conflict resolution at best. And we see what happens in our world when it breaks down.
Yeah. Well, I guess when you were describing this, which I love this, very simple response or question of, what is it that you need? But I suppose in many circumstances, it kind of presumes that the person or the group knows what they need at a fundamental level, right? Such that they're not projecting that onto the other person, right? And we can think about this interpersonally, where someone says, well, what I need is for you to do this, or you to
Yeah.
change and to stop being that way, right?
Yeah.
And we could also think about it even with the war in Ukraine. It's like, I need that. We need that territory, right? That's what we need, when really, like, that need is obviously some kind of symptom of a deeper need, some kind of spiritual need that's not being fulfilled. So how does Taoism then respond, or what would be a technique to kind of intervene in that sort of situation?
Oh boy. In that particular situation, someone, perhaps more than someone, some individuals, groups would need to come together and to help those two different polarities recognize the difference between what you say projection, what they want, okay, but what they truly need is something deeper.
Yeah.
Get beyond wants. Yeah, I want that for my ego. I've got to have a power domination here. Well, why? What's beneath that? Is there some kind of insecurity? Probably. Why would one big country invade another unless there was a sense of being threatened by Ukraine in some way? It seems like underneath a lot of that bullying and blustering, there's fear. Mm-hmm. And fear of somehow being vulnerable to NATO or being threatened by a democracy nearby. That's the underlying need. And we need a wise mediator who could get to that level. A long time ago now, when Jimmy Carter was president of the United States, he met with the leader of Sadat and Begin. Again, it was a long time ago, okay, at Camp David, and was trying to come up with, a peace accord, a peace agreement, and nothing worked. And they were ready to leave. And one of them took out pictures of his grandchildren. And then the other one said, oh, here are pictures of my grandchildren. And they realized, with Jimmy Carter's facilitation, that they wanted a world of peace for their grandchildren. Mm. And they signed the Camp David Accord. So they were in a place, they were in a neutral territory. Camp David is a president's retreat in our country, up in the hills, in nature with beautiful trees. So they were breathing in some nice Tao relaxation, but and they were not in their usual places, which helps people get more objective perspective. And they had Jimmy Carter, who was very patient, listening. So you have a neutral territory, a place where people can feel more at peace. You have a wise facilitator, and you have people reaching beneath their demands and their wants and their fears to an underlying need that they both share. Mm.
That's beautiful. I love that story of seeing the vulnerable side of the other person in the form of your family, and it seems quite simple, right? It's a humanization of the other. And through the simple, example of seeing someone's child or someone's grandchild. And what a simple but potentially radical tactic, in these conversations between people that consider themselves enemies. I can even think of examples that I've heard regarding people who, are against gay rights, or who don't like queer people in general, and because they but then they know this one gay or lesbian person, and they're like, oh, well, no, we love you, but those people, you know what I mean, and they don't see that connection, right? Because it's when they're intimate at hand, when they're close at hand, they can see the humanity of the other. But then we get kind of caught up in these ideas of the other that then dehumanize them, and it seems like this is just happening all over the place today.
Definitions and labels dehumanize, absolutely. When I live 60 miles south of San Francisco in California, and many years ago now, Harvey Milk, one of our supervisors who was gay, and a friend of one of my colleagues who was also gay, came and said, encourage everybody to come out and declare themselves, come out of the closet. If you're gay, come out. And I was wondering at the time, why? And then I could see why. Because, my next door neighbor, my colleague, my friend down the hall, my best friend's brother, all these people I knew, I realized, oh goodness, it's not those people, those nameless, stereotype people that we don't know. Those are our friends, our neighbors, and our families. This is our community. And it broke down barriers because everyone, around here realized that that gay people were part of our community. And, it's a lot more comfortable now to be gay, at least in some parts of the world. Other parts where, it's still dangerous and even life-threatening.
Wait, did you just tell me that you knew Harvey Milk?
I did not know Harvey Milk. My best friend and colleague went to college with Harvey Milk. Okay.
Wow.
So one removed from Harvey Milk.
Yeah, 2 degrees of separation. That's amazing. Yeah, I mean that film about him is one of the most incredible films. I can't remember the actor who is in it now, but such an incredible film. So yeah, this has been such a lovely conversation, Diane, and I'm really excited that your book, which is so beautiful and potentially transformative for people who have not, been introduced to Taoism and the way in which it can enrich our lives. I'm so glad your book is being, recirculated now, still as a book, but also as an audiobook. Are there any kind of concepts or teachings or anything from the book or Taoism more generally that you think would be important to share with the audience?
Okay, well, I think that a lot of people are feeling stressed and anxious these days for obvious reasons. And it's important for us to actively affirm hope. The Tao tells us that the way to greater light leads through the darkness. Going ahead feels like falling back. The even path seems rugged and hilly, the highest power a yielding valley. The Tao encourages us not to hide from the realities we face, but to acknowledge them mindfully and recognize what we're feeling. The way to greater light leads through the darkness. Relating the wisdom of the Tao to times like this, to be kind to ourselves, to spend time in nature, to take time to listen to ourselves, to ask, how am I feeling? What do I need right now? And there's a lot of research now that shows that mixed feelings are helpful in times of great stress, that it's up to us when we feel like we're in the middle of a dark night to go out and look at the stars and recognize that there are stars, there are bright spots in our lives, the people we know, the nature that we are part of, that enlivens us, that inspires us, the source of peace that we can find inside by pausing and taking a deep breath, and by simply being grateful for the small blessings in our lives. That is not to ignore the major challenges, but that's to balance the yin and the yang so that we can move forward in life with hope. So it's up to us, I think, each of us, to find our own guiding lights, our own stars that can guide us through this dark time.
Wow, that was what beautiful words. I can hear your English PhD in there.
Thank
That's
you.
beautiful words. It's yeah, I feel like we have to end, we can't add any more because I want to end on that beautiful note. Diane, it's been such a pleasure. I've been speaking with Diane Dreher, and her book, among many, is The Tao of Inner Peace. And you can also look into the Tao of Personal Relationships, the Tao of Womanhood, Inner Gardening, and Your Personal Renaissance. But the Tao of Inner Peace is the book that I read for today, and the one that's being recirculated or relaunched as an audiobook. And where can you find that audiobook? Is it on Amazon Audible and all the other suspects?
You bet. There's actually a free sample of it on Amazon Audible.
Okay, perfect. And is there anything else, Diane, that's coming up for you that you'd like to share with the audience?
I would just like to remind us that the Tao encourages us to combine yin and yang, awareness and action in our lives, and to just be mindful, of what we truly believe in and what we value, so that we can take positive action and move forward in this time.